June 18th, 1815. A Sunday that will profoundly alter the path of European history. 3 armies readied themselves for what would be dubbed the most significant fight of the 19th century on the muddy plains of Belgium, close to the tiny village of Waterloo. The man who had subjugated almost all of Europe and who had caused emperors and monarchs to shudder in the face of his military might was on one side. A coalition, on the other hand, was committed to permanently overthrowing his power. However, neither the general's strategy nor the soldier's bravery were the decisive factors in this conflict. Napoleon Bonaparte totally misjudged this tactical advancement, a covert weapon that would ultimately ruin not just his army, but his entire empire. This is not the story you are familiar with, yet it is the story of the fight of Waterloo. We will discuss more than simply infantry formations and horse charges. The secret that changed the battlefield will be revealed. Even the greatest military genius of his era was unable to recognize the unseen weapon until it was too late. Get ready to learn how something far more potent and revolutionary than steel and gunpowder was used in the greatest military triumph of the Napoleonic era. Join our community, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the time you watch this video before we start this epic adventure through one of the bloodiest days in European history. Let's see where our audience is coming from to accompany us on this momentous journey. We must travel back in time to comprehend what actually transpired at Waterloo. For decades, not a few months or years, we must know Napoleon Bonaparte's background and how he got to that battleground in June 1815. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Napoleon, who was born in Corsica in 1769, was a young officer in the artillery. He was raised in the midst of the turmoil, bloodshed, and drastic changes that made France a revolutionary republic instead of an absolute monarchy. Anything looked conceivable during that time, and talented men from all backgrounds could advance quickly. In the French sense, Napoleon was not born into an aristocratic family. He was in a peculiar position because his family was a tiny Corsican nobility, neither inside nor outside of the aristocracy. While attending French military institutions, he showed a remarkable aptitude for mathematics, especially the science of artillery. Napoleon viewed artillery as a precise science, a kind of military art that integrated physics, mathematics, and psychology. In contrast to other young officers who viewed guns as nothing more than crude instruments of destruction. His rise was quick. His artillery tactics helped drive British and Royalist forces out of the port city during the siege of Toulon in 1793, when he was only 23 years old. He received a brigadier general promotion. At the age of 26, he was appointed commander of the Italian army in 1796. Using quick thinking, excellent logistics, and innovative force deployment, he commanded an outstanding campaign against the Austrians. Napoleon's strategy for fighting wars distinguished him from other generals of his period. Napoleon favored speed, audacity, and the total annihilation of opposing forces, whereas most European commanders continued to fight in the way of the 18th century, which involved meticulously planned battles and risk-averse campaigns. He was not only interested in winning fights, his goal was to devastate opposing troops so thoroughly that they could no longer fight. He displayed a military genius not seen since the time of Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804. A pope or other ruler did not crown him, in order to demonstrate to the world that his authority came from his own conquests and not from divine right or ancestry. He revised the European map in the years that followed. He overcame the Russians at Friedland, the Prussians at Jena, and the Austrians at Austerlitz.
He disbanded the Holy Roman Empire, put his brothers on thrones across Europe, and established Paris as the epicenter of civilization. However, every empire has its weaknesses. Starting in 1808, the campaign in Spain became a violent nightmare. The Spanish fought a bloody guerrilla war that depleted French resources for years because they would not submit to French rule. The supply lines were overburdened. French soldiers, used to subsisting on the territory they had conquered, came upon antagonistic people who preferred to burn their own crops rather than provide food for the invaders. The French army, once thought to be unbeatable, started to appear lethal in Spain. Then followed the 1812 Russian catastrophe. Napoleon's Grande Armée, consisting of more than 600,000 men, invaded Russia, the greatest military force ever gathered in European history. He anticipated a quick, conclusive battle similar to his earlier triumphs. However, Napoleon was denied the combat he so urgently wanted as the Russians withdrew, setting fire to everything in their way. When a significant battle finally took place at Borodino, it was a horrifying massacre in which both sides suffered terrible casualties. When Napoleon arrived in Moscow, he discovered that the Russians themselves had set the city on fire. In the harsh winter of 1812, Russia's withdrawal was apocalyptic. Less than 100,000 of the 600,000 men came back. The survivors were traumatized, ill, and devastated. The idea that Napoleon was unbeatable was dispelled. The allies of France sensed blood in the river. He was opposed by Russia, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia. His own marshals started to have second thoughts. The 1813 German campaign was a last-ditch effort. Though he was up against tremendous odds, Napoleon displayed moments of his old genius. He was soundly defeated by a coalition of allied armies at the Battle of Leipzig, often called the Battle of the Nations. In 1814, Paris was overrun. After being forced to abdicate, Napoleon was banished to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. A sigh of relief went over Europe. The victorious nations convened at the Congress of Vienna to redraw Europe's borders, reinstate the old monarchs, and establish a balance of power that would keep any one country from assuming a dominant role in the future. The French throne was returned to Louis XVIII, the brother of the king who was put to death during the Revolution. The Napoleonic era appeared to be finished. It appeared that peace would finally prevail in Europe. However, Napoleon did not take defeat well. He watched and governed his little island on Elba. He watched France under the restored Bourbons. He watched the marginalization of the veterans who had accompanied him throughout Europe. He saw the attempts by the old nobles to undo the improvements brought about by the Revolution and his own administration, and he recognized an opportunity. Napoleon bravely fled Elba in February 1815 with a small force of perhaps 1,000 troops and landed on the French mainland. The next event was nearly magical. The Bourbon government sent troops to apprehend him, but they joined Napoleon after finding him. Entire regiments left the Royal Guard to march beneath its waters once more. As he got closer to Paris, Napoleon retook France in 20 days without firing a single shot. Louis XV escaped to Belgium in 1818. The Emperor had returned. This time would become known as the 100 Days. Although Napoleon knew his return was perilous, he would never be welcomed back by the European powers. Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately declared war. Huge armies began mobilizing to crush France once more. Napoleon's window of opportunity was limited. If he waited for all these armies to assemble, he would be fighting impossible odds. In order to force the Allies to negotiate peace from a position of strength, he needed to strike quickly and defeat the coalition forces one by one before they could unite. Marshal Blucher, who commanded the Prussian army, and the Duke of Wellington, who commanded an Anglo-Allied force in Belgium, had the closest armies.
There was some disunity between these two armies. They were separated by distance. Napoleon could put his army between them and defeat one first, then the other, if he could lead them swiftly. It was his style, but it was dangerous. Courage, quickness, and meticulously eliminating the adversary. He had conquered Europe in this manner, and he would attempt to do so again. Napoleon marched north with roughly 125,000 soldiers in June 1815. They surprised Wellington and Blucher by crossing into Belgium. Napoleon was able to precisely position his army between the Allied armies. He separated his forces on June 16th. While attacking the Prussians at Ligny, he dispatched Marshal Ney to restrain Wellington at Quatre Bras. The French won the Battle of Ligny. After suffering severe damage, the Prussians withdrew. Napoleon thought he had eliminated them from the conflict and that they would move eastward to reorganize, leaving Wellington defenseless and alone. But Napoleon committed a crucial mistake. Under Marshal Grouchy, he dispatched more than 30,000 men to hunt down the Prussians and make sure they didn't start any more problems. The Prussians under Blucher did not flee eastward as Napoleon had intended, and this severely undermined his main army. In order to keep in touch with Wellington and preserve the chance of rejoining the Anglo-Allied force, they withdrew northward. Blucher, an elderly Prussian commander who detested Napoleon and was committed to seeing him eliminated at all costs, made a superb military move. Wellington chose to stop when he saw that the Prussians could still help him. He decided to take a low ridge that provided an excellent defensive position south of the settlement of Waterloo. It was a great job. He could conceal the majority of his forces from French artillery fire and observation. In case something went wrong, there were good escape routes. Above all, the two armies could crush Napoleon between them if Blucher could get there in time. Wellington's multinational force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German infantry of various caliber numbered roughly 68,000 men. Many of the soldiers lacked experience. There were numerous untested units in addition to his best regiments, the veterans who had battled the French in the Iberian Peninsula. On the evening of June 17th, Napoleon arrived at Wellington's position. The area had become a quagmire due to the heavy rain. Napoleon decided to hold off on attacking until a.m. in order to give his cavalry and artillery time to maneuver and the ground time to dry out a little. It was another decision that would come under scrutiny. Napoleon didn't think Blücher could make it in time, or even that he would try. But each hour of delay gave the Prussians more time to get there. He didn't realize how determined the old Prussians were. The two armies readied themselves for combat on the morning of June 18th. Napoleon had a considerable advantage in artillery and roughly 72,000 men at his disposal, which was a little more than Wellington's. Wellington only had about 150 pieces of artillery. Many of the French soldiers had marched across Europe with Napoleon, making them seasoned veterans. They had an almost religious faith in their sovereign. They believed they would witness another of his miracles that day, because they had witnessed one on the battlefield previously. Napoleon had a rather simple idea. He would attack Wellington's center with a heavy barrage of artillery. Next, dispatch his brother Jerome to attack Hougoumont, a large fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. This flank attack would draw out Wellington's reserves. The major drive, a huge infantry column that would shatter Wellington's line and advance through the center of his position, would then be launched by Napoleon. The cavalry would then take advantage of the opening to decimate Wellington's force. Napoleon had fought and won similar conflicts numerous times. But Napoleon wasn't entirely aware of one problem. There was something distinctive about the force he was up against, something about the tactics and weapons the British would use, something about the way Wellington had organized his defense.
His expectations would be dashed by this covert weapon. Furthermore, it wasn't a groundbreaking technical advancement or a novel kind of cannon. It was something more understated, more incorporated into Wellington's army's basic organization. It was the method by which the British armed, trained, and led their troops. Let's examine what was so unique about British soldiers. Muskets were infamously inaccurate weapons in the armies of the time in Europe, notably the French. In order to create a wall of lead that could perhaps hit the adversary due to the sheer volume of firing, most armies trained their soldiers to shoot in a line. The Charleville, a French musket, was a dependable weapon. However, it possessed a poor rate of fire and was inaccurate beyond about 50 meters, like many flintlock muskets of the era. A skilled soldier can load and shoot a flintlock musket in roughly 30 seconds. The Brown Bess musket, which was not technically better than the Charleville, was employed by the British. Actually, it was comparable in a lot of respects. The manner the British trained their soldiers to utilize the weapon was different, not the weapon itself. The British Army was known for its strict discipline and rigorous training in shooting. Compared to soldiers in other militaries, British soldiers practiced shooting continuously. The British recognized that well-trained soldiers won battles, but the majority of European armies thought ammunition was too costly for widespread practice. Better shooting alone, however, was not the true British innovation. It was the way they set up their positions and fired. The British created the two-line formation, although the majority of European forces deployed in deep columns for the attack, which gave mass and momentum, but meant that only the soldiers at the front could shoot. This was a groundbreaking line, only 2 ranks deep. The British trained to fire devastating salvos at close range, waited until the enemy was quite close before firing, and it meant that nearly all soldiers could fire simultaneously, maximizing firepower. This strategy required remarkable discipline. As enemy columns marched at you, screaming, drumming, and bayonets flashing, it took steely nerves to remain motionless in a thin line. Although it took a lot of training to provide controlled and synchronized fire, wait for orders, and avoid firing too soon, the results were deadly when done right. At ranges where even imprecise weapons could not miss, hundreds of muskets would fire at once, forming a wall of fire that would hit an attacking column that was densely populated, and only the men at the front could utilize their weapons. Wellington knew the effectiveness of this strategy. After years of fighting the French in Spain and Portugal, he had honed it on the Iberian Peninsula. He had frequently demolished French advances with withering volleys, followed by bayonet charges, and he had frequently employed the thin line formation against French columns. Many members of Napoleon's army at Waterloo lacked the British Red Line knowledge and dread that French veterans who had fought on the peninsula had. And Napoleon, who had not been directly involved in the war for the peninsula, did not appear to completely understand the effectiveness of this strategy. The British system was more than that. Wellington made excellent use of the terrain as well. He placed his forces on reverse slopes or close behind ridges. Then, as the French moved in, expecting to find a bombarded line, they would find new, intact troops coming up from the position on the opposite slope, firing close-range, lethal salvos. Even though he had employed the same tactic frequently in Spain, French leaders were taken aback. Then the rifles appeared. The British possessed regiments with Baker rifles, but most of their army employed ordinary smooth-bore muskets. These rifles were substantially more accurate because of their rifled barrels which spun the ball. Far beyond a musket's practical range, a skilled marksman with a Baker rifle could hit targets at 200 or even 300 meters.
In order to harass the French, British riflemen were arranged into light infantry companies. They disrupted formations, picked off officers and artillerymen, and caused disorder. Guerrilla warfare was incorporated into a conventional army. The smart use of geography, the harassing and disruptive riflemen, the fine line with its immense firepower, and most importantly, the iron discipline that kept the soldiers in their posts under the most terrible fire. In Spain, the French had been defeated again and time again by this technique. Wellington had introduced this system to Waterloo. This was the covert weapon. Ordinary troops were turned into a horrifyingly effective killing machine by an integrated system of tactics, training, and leadership, not a single piece of technology. Napoleon, who was used to using his enormous attack columns, backed by powerful artillery, to destroy the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian forces, did not adapt his strategy to the situation he was facing. When he noticed a lesser army occupying a position, he thought that, as was so frequently the case in the past, the enemy resistance would be crushed by a tremendous bombardment followed by column attacks. He had used these strategies to defeat Wagram and Jena. Why wouldn't they return to work? This overuse of tried-and-true techniques, it would be lethal to not adjust to a new adversary with distinct capabilities. On the morning of June 18th, the combat started at around 11 a.m. Hougoumont, a sizable fortified farmstead on Wellington's right flank, was the target of the first assault. Napoleon gave the job to his younger brother, Jerome. Originally planned as a supplementary diversion, the raid on Hougoumont ended up being a day-long bloodshed. The buildings were transformed into strongholds by the Hanoverian and British defenders. Attack after attack was launched by the French, who also set houses on fire and fought in room after room. This conflict over a patch of land with little strategic significance had frustrated thousands of men. Originally intended to attract Wellington's reserves, it also attracted an increasing number of French soldiers. The Hougoumont offensive was a prime example of a strategy that committed considerably more resources than it was worth, whether it succeeded or failed. Napoleon launched his primary artillery barrage against Wellington's position center. As the battle at Hougoumont raged, more than 80 guns opened fire on the ridge where Wellington's forces were positioned, showering the area with round shot and shrapnel. Before the main infantry attack, it was supposed to be a devastating prelude that demoralized and weakened the defenders. However, it was not very effective. The majority of Wellington's forces were sheltered from direct view by being positioned on the other slope. Instead of ricocheting and causing large casualties as they would on firm, dry ground, the cannonballs that struck the damp ground tended to sink in. Wellington's formation remained intact despite the bombardment, which undoubtedly inflicted losses and was terrible for the troops on the receiving end. Napoleon gave the command for the first major infantry attack at 1 o'clock. The Queue d'Oing would command 4 divisions, totaling approximately 16,000 soldiers. Each division formed a huge column of battalions as the French troops advanced in huge columns. It was a striking scene, thousands of men chanting their support for the emperor while waving flags and marching in perfect line to the rhythm of drums. The ground shook under their feet. It appeared to be an unstoppable force of nature that would overpower any resistance. However, the French columns found that the bombardment had not decimated Wellington's troops when they arrived at the crest of the ridge. They encountered something unexpected as they ascended the slope, worn tired from the full rig ascent over soft, damp ground. The fire came when the British lines, which had been hiding behind the crest or lying down, suddenly rose. Musketry, volley after volley, delivered with mechanical accuracy. The French columns had their fronts chopped. Many men fell.
The columns stumbled. The British had a terrible advantage due to the laws of physics. Nearly every shot would strike someone in a column that was roughly 60 men wide, but many ranks deep. However, only the men in the front ranks were able to shoot back. Hundreds of muskets could be used at once by the British line, which was hundreds of meters long and maybe 2 ranks deep. It had to do with lethal mathematics. Several British fired back for every Frenchman who could fire. Additionally, the British were incredibly successful at close range because they were trained to deliver disciplined and controlled fire. In order to adequately return fire, the French columns attempted to deploy in line. However, this requires room and time, and it was almost impossible when under intense fire. The ranks split apart, officers fell. Wellington ordered his heavy cavalry, the Union Brigade, led by the Earl of Oxbridge, to charge after the offensive lost momentum. Nearly 2,000 strong riders on enormous horses, including Scots Dragoons, King's Guards, and Inniskillings, raced across the crest and descended upon the haphazard French. It had a disastrous effect. The cavalry attack caused the French infantry columns, which had already been broken by musket fire, to collapse. In a panic, thousands of French soldiers were murdered, taken prisoner, or ran away. Intoxicated by their victory, the British cavalry kept moving forward. They destroyed the gunners and rendered the weapons ineffective as they swept through the French artillery batteries. Napoleon personally bestowed the regiment's sacred standards, the French imperial eagles, which they captured. After a stunning victory, the British cavalry committed a deadly error. They exerted too much pressure. Deep inside the French lines, exhausted and ill-prepared, the new French cavalry, the couriers, and the lancers launched a counterattack. The British knights were slaughtered, their formations shattered, their horses weary. The Union Brigade's ability to battle was all but decimated. Of the 2,000 cavalry, just a few hundred came back. It was a tragic example of bravery triumphing over wisdom. The blow to Napoleon had been severe. With significant casualties, his primary infantry assault had failed. He wasn't one to give up easy. Then he got some unsettling news. The Prussians were on the way. Scouts reported Prussian columns arriving from the east. Just 2 days after being wounded at Ligny, Blucher was riding to join Wellington with his army. Now Napoleon was running out of time. Before the Prussians came in full force, he had to demolish Wellington. However, a strange event was going to occur. Napoleon's commander, Marshal Ney, who was dubbed the Brave of the Brave for his uncontrollable fearlessness, saw what he believed to be Wellington pulling men away from his position. Wellington was actually only relocating injured and repositioning soldiers. However, from a distance, Ney thought the British were withdrawing because gunpowder obscured the vision. Ney saw his own opportunity and took a stand that would turn out to be one of the most contentious in military history. He ordered to launch a huge cavalry attack on the British line's center. Ney united all the French cavalry available, nearly 5,000 knights, the best knights in France, couriers in their shining armor, dragoons, lancers, and hussars. Since the Crusades, no greater cavalry force had been gathered in one place. They started their attack around 3:30 in the afternoon after forming in waves. The sight was both spectacular and terrible. The ground trembled as thousands of horsemen thundered down the mountain, raising their lances and sabers and yelling for their emperor and their nation. However, Wellington was prepared. The classic defensive formation against cavalry, squares, are rapidly formed by his infantry brigades. Cavalry found it very difficult to penetrate an infantry square, which was composed of 4 sides of men with bayonets pointed outward, like a big hedgehog.
A wall of bayonets would prevent horses from charging, and troops could fire at the circling, angry cavalry from all sides of the squares. The French cavalry launched multiple attacks.
The British positions were smashed through by wave after wave. They attacked for over 2 hours, but the squares resisted. The crucial weapon was once again British discipline. The British forces held their positions despite terrible casualties from continuous musket and cannon bombardment. Any voids that arose when persons fell were promptly filled. Officers moved amongst the ranks in a composed manner, urging, threatening, and upholding discipline. French cavalrymen and horses were killed as the fire continued, and sergeants held the men in line. British artillery was very important. Shrapnel was launched by the gunners as the French horsemen advanced, thereby converting their cannons into enormous lead guns that blasted hundreds of musket balls in one burst. The gunners briefly dropped their cannons and fled to the safety of the closest infantry squares as the cavalry approached too closely. Frustrated by their failure to penetrate, the gunners fled to their pieces and continued the slaughter as soon as the cavalry passed. They were destroying the French cavalry. Thousands of knights and horses fell. Men and animals were dying alongside each other, and the hillside was littered with the dead and injured. However, Ney continued to dispatch more knights. It was foolish and a huge waste of some of the best soldiers in France. When Napoleon saw what Ney was doing, he became enraged and watched from a distance. Cavalry by itself could never penetrate squared-off infantry. To breach the formations and allow the cavalry to take advantage, they required infantry backup. However, in the midst of combat, consumed by the desire to win, they continued to feed knights to the meat grinder. Meanwhile, the Prussians were advancing on the right flank of France. Under Bülow's leadership, the first units of Blücher's Fourth Corps launched an assault on the French rear town of Plananoa. In order to combat this new threat, Napoleon had to reallocate valuable troops. He dispatched some of his finest troops, the Young Guard, to Plananoa. House by house, street by street, a bloody struggle broke out in the village. The Prussians were originally driven out by the French, but more kept coming. Blücher was putting every man he could find into the fight because he was committed to keeping his word to Wellington at whatever costs. The situation for Napoleon was gradually getting worse. His first infantry onslaught had failed. Effortless strikes were killing the cavalry. His rear and flank were under pressure from the Prussians. There was not much time left. Before additional Prussians arrived and the situation became desperate, he wanted a decisive strike, something that would permanently weaken Wellington. The Imperial Guard was his last card to play. The Imperial Guard was the highest-ranking unit in the French army. They were the veterans of the veterans, guys who had marched from Madrid to Moscow and back, and who had fought in scores of wars. They were commanded by the top officers, had unique uniforms, and were paid more. Napoleon saved them for the decisive moment, the final blow that would finish off an adversary that was already in a vulnerable position. The Imperial Guard was claimed to have never backed down or failed in a charge. Their very presence on the battlefield had the power to demoralize the enemy. At approximately 7 p.m., as the sun was starting to set, Napoleon gave the order for the Imperial Guard to move forward. Speaking directly to these guys who had stood by him through both success and failure, he shaped them. In multiple columns, over 5,000 members of the Middle and Old Guard moved toward the center of Wellington's defenses. Napoleon led them a portion of the way before entrusting them to Ney, who, in spite of his past transgressions, was still one of Europe's most valiant leaders. The Guard moved through the smoke and confusion, moving with mechanical accuracy up the slope. Despite the artillery fire that started to fall on them, they marched in time with the drummers. Their entrance gave the army new life as they passed French soldiers who were worn out from earlier attacks. The Guard was coming at them. The Guard would prevail.
This was the norm. As they prepared to take advantage of the impending advance, French soldiers started to stand to follow the Guard. Wellington noticed the Guards coming. He knew it was dangerous. His entire position may fall apart if the Guards broke his line or caused a breach. But he had a surprise ready. Some of his finest soldiers were in reserve, concealed behind the ridge and unaffected by the earlier assaults. These were the 5th Division, Britain's elite infantry, and the British Guards, which included seasoned Peninsular War veterans. The French Imperial Guard rushed to the top of the crest and up the slope. They must have believed they were going to overtake the weaker enemy through the smoke and dim dusk light, when Wellington said the well-known phrase, "Now, Maitland, now is your chance." The Guards from Britain, who had been hiding behind the ridge, stood up. At a distance of maybe 40 yards, more than 1,000 muskets were pointed at the Imperial Guard. Though it only lasted a few minutes, what followed altered the path of history. On the Imperial Guard, the British won volley after volley. It was impossible to miss at such close range with targets so closely spaced. The Guard's front lines were utterly destroyed. Men fell in great numbers, the weight of the flames shattering their proud, lovely shapes. Although they were in column, they attempted to return fire. They were being massacred by a line that could bring nearly all its soldiers to bear, and just a small portion of them were able to use their weapons. The Guard faltered. Wellington ordered a bayonet attack when the Guard hesitated for the first time in their legendary history. Shouting, the British Guards moved forward with their bayonets fixed. Other Allied and British units joined the assault elsewhere along the line. Unthinkably, the Imperial Guard began to withdraw. They didn't start running in a panic. They were retreating, but they were fighting their way back. The unthinkable had occurred. They were defeating the Guard. Like wildfire, the news spread throughout the battlefield, Gardula. The French army, which had survived a day of bloodshed and was clinging to its emperor and Guard's invincibility, is escaping as the Guard retreats. It was terrible to the mind. All was lost if the Guard could be overpowered. Fear spread. Suddenly, units that had been stable throughout the day broke. Unstructured armies started to break up into a fugitive horde. Wellington recognized the opportunity. In order to signal a general advance, he rode to the head of his lines and waved his hat. The whole line of the Allies started to move forward. After hours of torment, 68,000 troops who had guarded that ridge launched an attack. The French were demoralized, worn out, its elite was defeated, and the Prussian threat to their flank was broken. The retreat turned into a path. Troops dropped their weapons and fled.
Whole units fell apart. A flurry of escaping men, cars, abandoned cannons, and injured people clogged the southbound road. Order was only upheld by the oldest and most seasoned members of the Imperial Guard. They covered the army's escape by forming squares and retreating gradually. According to folklore, General Cameron spoke a single profanity in response to being ordered to surrender. They sacrificed their life in the final battle to allow the emperor to make his getaway. It couldn't change the outcome, but it was a last act of bravery and loyalty that made the catastrophe even more tragic. The Prussians joined the chase, now coming in full force. The Prussians pressed on through the night, while the exhausted British only pursued a short distance before halting to regroup. They fulfilled the promise they made to Wellington that they would destroy the French. They pursued the escaping French for miles, offering them no leniency and apprehending thousands of them. At some point along the way, Napoleon departed the battlefield. Instead of a spectacular explosion, his dream had ended in a wretched nighttime flight. They had completely vanquished a guy who had been heralded as the greatest military genius of his day. The 72,000-strong force he had commanded that morning had been decimated. 15,000 were taken prisoner, 25,000 were killed or injured, and the others were dispersed.
The disaster had biblical proportions. The Allied casualties were equally catastrophic. Approximately 15,000 men had been killed or injured in Wellington. About 7,000 had been lost by the Prussians. Bodies, injured people wailing for assistance, and dying horses made the battlefield a horror. The fight was named for the little settlement of Waterloo, which was turned into a massive hospital with wounded people occupying every structure. The creek that flowed through the battlefield had blood in it. Wellington sobbed when he realized how many of his officers and men had been killed, many of whom he knew personally. Nothing but a fight lost can be half as mournful as a battle won, he famously remarked. The cost to the lives of fine men was devastating, but he had achieved the greatest significant triumph of his career. In his lengthy life, Wellington would never engage in combat again. But what was the covert weapon that really brought Napoleon to his knees? It was an interconnected system of tactical and technical superiority rather than a single entity. Against attacking columns, the British double-file line used deadly firepower. Under the most horrifying circumstances, British soldiers were able to provide regulated fire because of their exceptional discipline and training. It was the deft use of topography to protect soldiers from artillery. The French formations were shattered and disoriented by the rifles. When every instinct cried out for escape, men were held to their posts by the cool, collected, professional leadership of officers. It was, at its core, a philosophical divergence in the organization and training of armies. Despite its tactical genius and the valor of its soldiers, the French army mostly relied on mass column-based attacks that depended on shock and momentum. It performed admirably against forces that fought similarly, or against adversaries whose fire was so ill-coordinated or insufficiently strong that the attack could close before being halted.
but against a force capable of delivering precise and large-scale fire at close range, with the discipline to maintain its position under duress and having specially devised strategies to counter this approach, the French approach didn't work. In essence, the British military's breakthrough in infantry training served as the hidden weapon. The conflict in India and the Iberian Peninsula sharpened a revolution that had been swimmering for decades. The British had developed a system of training, tactics, and doctrine based on the understanding that, in the era of the flintlock musket, the side that could fire more precise shots in a shorter amount of time would prevail in infantry fights. Despite his brilliance, Napoleon had not sufficiently adjusted. He had used his tried-and-true strategies to win so many battles that he was blind to the fact that his opponent had discovered a countermeasure. His strategies had wiped out the Russians at Friedland, the Prussians at Jena, and the Austrians at Austerlitz. But Wellington was neither Russian nor Austrian Prussian. He had studied Napoleonic tactics, engaged in years of combat with them, and developed the means to overcome them. Additionally, there was the alliance factor. Wellington was promised Prussian backup, but Napoleon was fighting alone. Despite his own injuries and his army's fatigue, Blücher's resolve to honor his promise and march to the sound of the cannons was essential. Wellington might not have decided to fight at Waterloo if it weren't for the Prussians, and things might have turned out differently even if he had.
Napoleon was compelled to split his army due to the Prussian threat, first diverting valuable men to restrain the Prussians at Plonnoir, and then sending Grouchy on a rambling quest. This made it impossible for him to focus his entire force on a single enemy, and diluted his attacks against Wellington. One might also argue for the human element. At Waterloo, Napoleon was not at his best. He was sick, perhaps with hemorrhoids or some other condition that made riding hard. He was worn out from the stress of years of fighting, the trauma of the Russian campaign, and the responsibility of deciding his country's future. He made decisions that Napoleon of Austerlitz, who was younger and more active, most likely would not have made. Subordinates like Ney received important orders from him, but they were unable to carry out his plans as intended. Every key stage of the conflict would have been personally supervised by Napoleon in 1805. Napoleon in 1815 was less involved in the important details and more detached. But Wellington should not be denied credit. He engaged in a valiant defensive fight, from selecting the terrain to arranging his forces, from planning his counterattacks to keeping his reserves. Every choice he made was almost flawless. He was aware of the advantages and disadvantages of his troops. He placed his stronger units where they were most required, and his weaker units where they would probably be spared the worst of the strain. Despite being under tremendous strain, he maintained his composure and rode alongside his lines during the most crucial parts of the conflict. His presence was visible to his troops and gave them confidence. Waterloo's effects were severe and long-lasting. On June 22nd, 4 days later, Napoleon abdicated once more. There was no going back this time.
Anticipating treatment as a high-ranking prisoner of war, possibly banished to America or England, he turned himself in to the British. Rather, the British sent him to St. Helena, a far-flung island thousands of miles from anywhere else in the South Atlantic. He would spend the final 6 years of his life there, arguing with his British guardians, dictating his memoirs, and gradually deteriorating. Still confined to his island jail, he passed away in 1821 at the young age of 51. The Napoleonic Wars, a quarter-century of almost constant fighting that had changed Europe, came to an end at Waterloo. The Symphony of Europe, a system of international diplomacy created by the winning states, was intended to keep any one country from assuming dominance in the future. It was a remarkable success. Not until the Crimean War in 1853 would there be another war in Europe, and not until World War I would there be another war involving all the major countries. The longest period of relative peace that Europe had experienced in millennia began in 1941 with the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's contributions to Europe were not entirely undone. The ideas of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, such as national rights, popular sovereignty, and meritocratic rather than aristocratic administration, could not be entirely eradicated, despite the victor's best efforts to restore many of the old monarchs during the Congress of Vienna. These ideas had all been sown and would continue to grow. The Italian and German unification drives, as well as the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, they were all rooted in the time Napoleon had ushered in. The lessons learned from Waterloo have been studied militarily for many decades. Military academies around the world have examined the significance of infantry firepower, the necessity of cooperation between different combat weaponry, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Perhaps the most important lesson, however, was one that many generals overlooked. Success in the past does not ensure success in the future. The strategies must change to overcome new challenges, and that flexibility is just as important as custom. The nature of warfare was changing. One of the last conflicts of the line and column warfare era, in which armies engaged in close quarters on open fields, was Waterloo. The machine gun, barbed wire, breech-loading rifle, controlled recoil artillery, and eventually the tank and aeroplane would arrive in the ensuing decades. Every invention would change the nature of conflict. On a deeper level, however, the lessons were unchanged. Leadership, flexibility, discipline, and training. These have always been the real secret weapons of winning armies, and always will be. Whether they lived or died, the day of the battle at Waterloo was just an unimaginable nightmare for the common men who fought there. Many veterans would live with the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. These guys were simply supposed to move on with their lives in a time before post-traumatic stress disorder was acknowledged.
A few did. Others died of poverty, drunkenness, or suicide as a result of their memories destroying them. The destinies of the wounded were especially terrible. Early 19th century medicine was rudimentary. There was no such thing as general anesthesia. The patient was awake during the surgery, yelling in agony.
The most common treatment for severe limb injuries was amputation, which was done with common instruments, without sterilization, and with the patient restrained by powerful men. Most of the badly injured died from infection. Because there were few social safety nets and government pensions, individuals who survived were frequently left to fend for themselves on the streets after being chronically disabled. After the conflict, the battlefield was the scene of atrocities that are hard for us to comprehend now. Looters, both local residents and troops, prowled among the dead and dying, robbing them of all that was valuable: boots, clothing, and teeth that may be used as artificial teeth. Men who were still alive were reportedly stripped nude and abandoned to perish from exposure. Eventually, the deceased were collected and either buried in mass graves or burned. The bones were excavated and used for fertilizer years later. A horrible destiny for warriors who had valiantly served their countries. Almost instantly, the little community of Waterloo became a popular tourist destination. Thousands of people visited the field where history was created in the months and years following the conflict. They strolled around the grounds gathering buttons, musket balls, mementos, and pieces of equipment. Local business people set up museums including battle items. Years later, Wellington himself went to the battlefield and was troubled by how it had been turned into a spectacle. The land was changed when the Lion's Mound, a massive earthen mound, was erected to mark the location of the Prince of Orange's wounds. Waterloo created and destroyed reputations. After becoming a national hero in Britain, Wellington went on to become Prime Minister. In Prussia, Plurke was hailed as Germany's liberator. One of France's most valiant warriors met a horrible end when the reconstituted Bourbon government found Ney guilty of treason and had him put to death by firing squad. Some of Napoleon's marshals fled into exile or quietly retired. Grouchy spent the remainder of his life claiming that he had correctly obeyed orders and was not responsible for the defeat, even though his failure to stop the Prussians from reaching Waterloo was vital. In his memoirs at St. Helena, Napoleon himself rewrote history. He placed the blame on his subordinates, especially Grouchy and Ney. He maintained that he would have prevailed if he had been in better health, if his marshals had carried out his orders correctly, and if the previous night's rain had not caused his attack to be delayed. He never really came to terms with the fact that Wellington had outclassed him, that his strategies had been outperformed, and that his opponent had simply been superior that day. He refused to believe that even geniuses may be defeated, and he remained steadfast in his belief in his own brilliance. His inability to take full responsibility for his setback has a profoundly human quality. It is easier to place the blame elsewhere, on bad luck, or on uncontrollable circumstances, than to face oneself and acknowledge one's own shortcomings. History, however, is more clear. At Waterloo, Napoleon committed strategic and tactical mistakes. He misjudged his opponent. He was unable to adapt to his new tactical circumstances. He made a poor division of his soldiers. He gave crucial commands to underperforming subordinates. Above all, he had to contend with a military system that was fundamentally better than his own, the British infantry training and tactics system. In the end, better training, planning, an understanding of the tactical realities of musket battle served as the secret weapon. No magic was involved. It was no enigmatic technology.
It required diligence, meticulousness, a resolve to settle for less than ideal, and a willingness to try new things.
The British had been working on their strategies for years, testing and perfecting them in battle. They had created a technique that made regular soldiers into incredibly skilled combatants. And this system's value was demonstrated in the most dramatic way conceivable on June 18th, 1815. Waterloo shows us that training, readiness, and a readiness to change and adapt are essential in both life and combat. It shows us how deadly arrogance and the presumption of superiority based on prior achievements can be. It shows us that sometimes employing what you have more skillfully than your opponent can give you the crucial edge rather than having more troops or better weapons. It teaches us the importance of leadership and how individual choices at pivotal times may alter the path of history. In a broader sense, Waterloo serves as a reminder of the horrific price of war. On that one day, about 40,000 soldiers were murdered or injured. 40,000 families were devastated. 40,000 lives were lost or irrevocably changed. For what purpose? In order for one individual to maintain his throne? In order to revive old monarchies? In order to draw Europe's map in one direction instead of another? It is hard to escape feeling a sense of terrible waste when we reflect on our fortunate status in the 21st century. However, we must equally keep in mind that these were not abstractions to those who experienced that time. Napoleon represented the revolution and the idea that ability and merit should take precedence over privilege and birth in the eyes of the French. He was seen by his opponents as a symbol of oppression, violent conquest, and the upheaval of lawful order. Both sides felt they were fighting for their nations, their beliefs, and vital principles and ways of life. At Waterloo, the soldiers who marched to their deaths did so because they believed in something bigger than themselves, not just because they were told to. This belief and this readiness to put everything on the line for a cause is the best and worst part of our nature. It is what enables us to accomplish heroic deeds of bravery and selflessness. It is also what enables us to cause one another terrible disasters. Waterloo was a monument to our capacity for devastation as much as a victory of the human spirit. The guys who fought there showed incredible courage by facing hours of fear that would have broken most modern individuals in a matter of minutes. However, it was courage used to support a system, the Napoleonic War, that claimed millions of lives throughout Europe for more than 20 years. It's worthwhile to consider what really happened on that muddy field in Belgium in June 1815 as we come to the close of this prolonged journey through one of the most important days in European history. An era came to an end. Napoleon's vision of a French-led unified European empire was dashed. The idea that military brilliance and boldness could overcome everything was challenged. It was shown that new military structure and tactics were better to older ones. Tens of thousands of men gave their lives to spread awareness of these truths. It was not a secret weapon that brought down Napoleon's empire. It was right there. It was the training of a British soldier who practiced with his musket for hours on the fire range. When instinct cried out for men to flee, it was the sergeant's discipline that kept them in line. It was a general's tactical understanding of how to manipulate the terrain to keep his troops safe.
It was the will of an ally who persevered despite fatigue to fulfill a commitment. All of these elements worked together to create a cohesive system of military superiority that outperformed the strategies that had taken over Europe. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away on St. Helena. There are rumors that his last words were, "France, army, chief of the army, Josephine." He imagined himself in his prime, leading his army to victory while being adored by his first love. The truth was a middle-aged man dying of illness on a secluded island, his dream in ruins, his family scattered, and his empire destroyed. When someone who has risen so high has such a pitiable finish, it's hard not to feel some sorrow. But we also need to remember the price of his aspirations. Between 3 and 6 million people are estimated to have died in the Napoleonic Wars, including both soldiers and civilians, as a result of fighting, famine, disease, and the overall upheaval that comes with conflict.
Spain was in ruins. Years of war tore Germany to pieces. Russia suffered greatly as a result of the 1812 invasion. Napoleon also claimed to be serving France, which was twice attacked, conquered, forced to make large reparations, and for decades degraded from a great power to a second-rate state. Was it all in vain? Not totally. The Napoleonic Code, which encapsulated the legal reforms Napoleon instituted, has endured and continues to have an impact on legal systems worldwide. The Napoleonic era contributed to the 19th century's flourishing of concepts such as merit over privilege, logical rather than arbitrary government, and national rights. Europe was compelled to modernize after being shook from its medieval architecture. Napoleon's legacy may therefore include some advancements toward more contemporary social and political structures, in addition to conflict and devastation. One of the most researched and legendary moments in military history is still Waterloo. That one day has been the subject of entire libraries. Every decision, unit movement, cavalry charge, and musket shot has undergone extensive analysis. What would have happened if Napoleon had launched his offensive sooner is still up for dispute among historians. If Grouchy had come in time, if Ney hadn't wasted the cavalry, if the Prussians hadn't been delayed for a couple more hours. Though ultimately only conjecture, they are interesting questions. We are certain of what actually occurred and how it changed the course of history. For the soldiers who were there and made it through that horrific Sunday, Waterloo was just the scariest day of their life. Many kept the horrifying recollections to themselves and never discussed it. Others recounted their experiences again and again to handle the trauma. In an attempt to block out the memories, some resorted to drinking. Others drew courage from their survival and began to live their lives with a fresh sense of gratitude for every day. When studying military history, it's easy to focus on big plans, army movements, and generals' decisions. But we must never lose sight of the fact that each person fighting a conflict has their own ambitions, dreams, and anxieties. Every one of the 40,000 people who lost their lives at Waterloo was a person. A son who would never be able to see his mother again. A man whose children will never grow up. A widow's was left by her spouse. A young man whose life was interrupted before it had a chance to start. They all mattered. They were all different. When they passed away, each of them left a void. Perhaps the most important lesson from Waterloo has nothing to do with military strategy or tactics. Maybe it's about the dreadful price of human ambition and the frailty of human life. Napoleon desired fame. He desired power. Making his stamp on history was his goal. All of this he did, but at what price? A ruined continent, millions of dead,
and his own wretched demise on a prison island. Was the cost really worth it? Every generation needs to ask itself these questions. It's important to remember the lessons learned at Waterloo when we consider the world of today with its own conflicts and tensions. There is always a cost to war. Blood is always purchased by victory. And sometimes pursuing fame and power only results in misery and devastation. The Battle of Waterloo was essential to bringing an end to Napoleonic power. But it was also a tragedy, an almost unfathomable loss of life. We remember not only the generals and their tactics, not only the secret weapon that changed the outcome of the conflict, but also the tens of thousands of regular men who faced unfathomable terror and carried out their orders as we come to the end of this epic journey through one of the bloodiest and most pivotal days in European history. Others just managed to survive, while others displayed unfathomable courage. Everyone is worthy of being remembered. The story of Waterloo is one of bravery and terror, of brilliance and failure, of triumph and setback. This story serves as a reminder of both humanity's best and worst qualities. More than 200 years later, we can still learn valuable lessons from this story about leadership, readiness, and the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. Above all, it serves as a reminder of the value of every human life and the awful consequences that result from using violence to settle disputes. May Waterloo teach us. May we pay tribute to those who lost their lives on that far-off field and work to create a society in which such sacrifices are never again required. May the souls who left on that awful day be blessed by the Lord God in His boundless mercy. Soldiers from every nation who gave their lives in valiant combat. May He console their descendants and give us all the wisdom to appreciate peace and grow from history's harsh lessons. May we never forget that all life is valuable in the eyes of the Creator, and that true greatness is found in creating a more equitable and peaceful society for all coming generations. Amen.